It's a great pleasure for me to talk to this audience. The book I've been working on for the last 7 or 8 years, China and Japan, just came out. And the first time I talked about it was Harvard University. The second time I'm talking about it is at York University. And I think that's quite appropriate because of all the materials I've used for the book, none has been more important than the work of Josh Vogel. And I think Josh Vogel, by not only the 28 books that he's translated, but he's opened up the field of historical work in the Western languages between China and Japan. I don't read classical Japanese, I don't read classical Chinese, but Josh does. And without his, what I've done in this book, I think of as kind of connecting the dots. I've tried to give an integrated history of the relation between the two countries from the year 600 up to the present time. And what Josh has done is pioneering work in all those areas. And I think without all the work that he had done, I wouldn't have been able to do this. There are other people who've done a lot of basic studies I've used, but none more than Josh. The second person that I want to mention is Paul Evans, because Paul, who used to teach here and is here today with his wife, was my co-teacher in my last year teaching at Harvard, and we worked very well together. He abandoned York for British Columbia, but I think he's still loyal to York University. And the third person, I'll explain it this way. I worked in the U.S. government for a couple of years, and while I was doing that, I rented out my house. And the guy who rented out my house worked out a deal with him that I would live in one bedroom when I came back to Cambridge over weekends, and he would live in the other bedroom with his wife. And so my wife and I lived in one. And we became like cousins. And I had known him for a long time before, and that guy's name is Bernie Froelich. So I feel kind of a special connection with York, with all those three people. And there are even more connections here I won't go into. But I do feel very, very pleased. Now, I thought I'd start with the motivations for writing this book. Because I started out as a sociologist, and my best friend in graduate school's daughter is here. My best friend in graduate school, Norm Bell, was a Toronto boy, and his daughter is here today too. And so my field as a sociologist was to work on the contemporary area. And after graduate school, I went to Japan and worked on Japan. And then I worked on China. But I never tried to work on the relations between the two countries. And I felt that my job was to try to educate students, and then after I retired, the broader public about the world of Asia. So when I retired in 2000, I decided that the most important thing was to try to educate the public about China. And so I picked what I thought that was the most important thing, the change to reform and opening that was led by Deng Xiaoping. I spent 10 years working on Deng Xiaoping. When I finished that book in 2010, the relations between China and Japan were at their worst ever. They had been bad, but they got worse, and they were really at a low peak. And I thought, I had worked on both those two countries. I didn't know much about history, I was not a historian, but I wanted to contribute. I thought I had so many friends in both countries. I wanted those two countries to be able to get along together. And I had the dream or the illusion that I might make a contribution to that. And I had the rather unusual good fortune of having one book on Japan that became a bestseller in Japan. Japan is #1. And a book on China, Deng Xiaoping and the Deng Xiaoping Shidai, in the Chinese translation, it became a bestseller in China. So I thought that I might be able to reach an audience in both places if I did the history. And so I spent the next 7, 8 years, and trying to learn about the history and reading Josh Vogel and others' work, and trying to get an overview about the history between those two countries. What I'll do today is talk about the relations between the two countries The book is 500 pages, so I'm not going to try to bore you with the whole book today. But what I thought I would do is pick the 3 times when one country learned most from the other. I think there were 3 times that they had really very intense learning. The first is when Japan learned from China, and the next 2 were when China learned from Japan. So I'll start, the first was from the period 600 AD until 838. And the reason I use that time frame, 600, Japan sent the first formal mission to China to learn from China. And they continued sending those missions, and the last mission was in 838 AD. They thought later they might send another one, but they decided not to. And so that's the first period when Japan was learning from China. And so let me tell you about that period. First, the second period is after 1895, when China was learning from Japan, and the third is after 1978, when China was again learning from Japan. So the first time period, 600 AD, I think it was a fortuitous time in a number of ways. China had just been united into the Sui dynasty, and so they had a strong central government that was located in Chang'an. And Chang'an then had, some people estimate 1 million people. It was probably the biggest city in the world, and it was very cosmopolitan, and it was very advanced, and had a very strong administrative structure that covered sort of the whole Yellow River basin. So that was united by the Sui in 589. A couple decades later, in 618, they lost out to the Tang, but that was even more united. So that Japan had a lot to learn from a united country. And in Japan at that time, in 600, when they sent the first mission, they had just been united in 593 by Empress Suiko. At that time, she became the top leader in Japan. And at that time, Japan's rule, they didn't have a central administrative structure. They had roughly 30 clans, and the leadership structure was based on members from different clans, and they tried to work together. And she was the leader of the largest clan, the Soga clan, and she decided that she wanted to build a broader administrative structure that covered a broader geographical area, and that went to what we might call a state administrative structure, to what had been until that time of 600, basically a structure of clans working together. And so the interest in going to Chang'an to learn about this was to, there are a lot of different things that historians have done, and I think that that overall perspective helps understand why all these different parts were used and how it fit together. Until that time, Japan did not have a single written language. They didn't have a written language. But they have a broader administrative area where people could not easily travel in one day. You wanted to have some kind of communication between one locality and another, and you needed some kind of language that would stretch between them. And you also needed to send certain kind of understandings, and to have that written down made it much clearer and more precise about what the people in the different areas should do and what the relationship was. And you also, in addition to the language, you needed some kind of rules about how you would get taxation and money back to the local area. You needed how you would draft people for the military, how you would get people to work on the roads and to do labor that would be working for the larger administrative structure. And so they had to develop codes that would provide that. And what Chang'an had already developed under the Sui, and even more during the Tang, were all those kinds of things. So in the written language, of course, it took some decades to have it very widely accepted. But until that time, archaeologists have found there were certain mounds where occasionally there were Chinese characters that had appeared in Japan, but there was no unified larger language. And what they did during this period after 600 AD was gradually bring in and unify a national written language that was based on China. In addition to those rules, they also wanted to have an administrative locality. Until that time, they had ruled whatever was the leading clan in Japan had what was kind of the largest administrative structure where the clan was located. But they decided they needed a regular city to be able to stretch out and have a kind of structure that would be like a capital. And Chang'an had a big north and south axis, and it had a lot of rectangular cross streets. And so in 710, some years after Siko came to power, they were able to lay out that administrative structure in Nara, and it was based precisely on Chang'an. And toward the end of that century, a lot of the people ruling said that they were afraid that some of the priests were getting too strong, and they wanted to move to a new capital, so they laid out the Heian capital, Kyoto, and based exactly on Chang'an. If you go to Kyoto today, the layout of the city is still based on Chang'an. You have those numbered streets across. The palace is at the north end of the thing, and you have various other kind of structures around the city, but based precisely on the capital that they saw in China. So it was an administrative center. Then, in addition to that, they felt they needed some kind of belief system that would support and give legitimacy to the ruler. And at that time, they felt Buddhism, well, it's of course started in India, but it had become the Chinese religion. And the Japanese learned about it, not from India, but from China. And so they thought of China as kind of the home country of Buddhism. And the leader, Tianhuang, it's the relation Tian being heaven, and the ruler. And he got legitimacy because there was kind of a natural order that was connected with the heavens that gave legitimacy to the natural order. So the Japanese set up Tenno, and Ten, the character for Ten, of course, heavens, the same way as Tianhuang. And Buddhism became a kind of religious structure. And the intellectuals of the day from 600 to 838, while Japan was free from China, were Buddhist monks. I mean, they were the intellectual. Just like in the Middle Ages, a lot of the priests and so forth were the most intellectuals of the day. So the Buddhist monks played a very key role in bringing culture. And every 15 or 20 years, Japan would send a mission, maybe 3 or 4 ships, 100, 200 people on a ship. And then they would often leave a monk, or several monks, who would stay in Chang'an over a period until the next boat came along, or next mission came along 10, 15 years later. So they really studied and they really understood what was going on in Chang'an. So these monks brought back a very deep culture. Then they also wanted to have some kind of political belief system that supported the legitimacy. And Confucianism was very useful because Confucianism taught younger brother listens to the older brother, kids listen to parents, and of course you listen to your lord, the higher level. And that provided a strong belief system that again helped support the legitimacy of the government. So for the Japanese that became very attractive to have that kind of legitimation system that supported the leadership. And they also wanted to have some kind of historical narrative that supported the leader. In China, of course, you have dynastic history. And the dynastic history, the motive always showed that the present dynasty were virtuous and all the rogues were defeated, and the present dynasty wins. So Japan wanted to have a dynastic history that went way back. Now, somehow in Japanese culture, the heredity was more important than in China. China had somehow earlier become much more of a meritocratic place where you try to select leaders. And of course, when in Japan and setting up the broader administrative region, you tried to begin to get officials who represented the whole structure and not some particular clan. They were chosen representing the clan, but they still had a very strong belief in history and in heredity. And therefore, when they wrote the Kochiki and the Honshoki, which were their adapted versions of the dynastic history, they traced it way back to when the heavens came down to Japan, all the way down to current Japan. And they provided those histories that really, as I say, grew out of the dynastic history, but provided that. Now, even though there were only a small number of people going on these missions, you can see that the basic structure of a broader administrative region really grew from what Japan was learning in China, and a lot of the appreciation for Chinese civilization grew from there. And fortunately, at that time, they had good relations. The Sui and later the Tang were proud of what they had done. They didn't feel any threat from Japan. They were happy to welcome people from many different countries to come to Chang'an. And so they were quite receptive to having people come and pay homage. And from Japan's point of view, they were eager to learn. And so there were not basically antagonistic relations during this period from 600 to 838. So they therefore learned a tremendous amount. The surprising thing, in a way, is what a small number of people were involved in this basic transition. You only had those, it was dangerous. A lot of the missions on ships were drowned on the way, and there was a lot of special ceremonies where they set off ships because of fear of drowning. But when they came back at the end of 838, by over maybe 10, 20,000 people involved in all, a very basic civilizational transfer had occurred, and Japanese civilization therefore drew very heavily on Chinese civilization. Now I'm going to leap through the next centuries. There were continued contacts, and but there was nothing that was nearly as deep, and that small number of people, maybe 10, 20,000 involved, were able, because it was sent by the Japanese leaders and it was adopted by the Japanese leaders, and they restructured their society as a result of what they learned from China to build a very new civilization. Now, last year, there were 8 million Chinese tourists to Japan. On the average day, there were over 25,000 Chinese who arrived in Japan. That was far more than in these 238 years that I've talked about. And yet, still that very small number of people, because it was a relatively small structure at the time, because it was introduced by the leader of Japan, and they were able to institutionalize what they learned, that it had such a basic impact on Japanese civilization. Now, as I say, I'm leaping. There are many interesting things that happened during these centuries, but there was never anything that had as profound an impact on one country or the other as that period from 600 to 838. So the next period I'm going to talk about is the period from 1895 between the Sino-Japanese War, the first Sino-Japanese War, and the second Sino-Japanese War. You can date it in 1931 when the Manchurian Incident, or you can start it in 37 when the Japanese came over, invaded in a big way. But during that time, from 1895, there was a tremendous amount of learning from China to Japan. And this learning was of a very different order and a very different kind. Because the Chinese empire fell apart in 1911, and there was no central structure, the learning from Japan during this period did not take place in an organized leadership fashion. But when the imperial examination system fell apart in 1905, the ambitious family wanted to send, until that time, prepare for examinations. But already after the 1895, there were a lot of people feeling that the exams were going to end soon time, and the dynasty was in trouble. So there was no central kind of examination system. And the people were learning on their own. So what you had after 1895 was a lot of families. There was no set curricula, and they knew that they wanted to learn about the modern world. And it cost a lot of money to go to Europe. And so for a lot of families whose money didn't go that far in Europe, the best place to send people to learn about the new modernization was to Japan. The 1895 was an absolute shock to the Chinese, because at that time they really looked down upon Japan as not amounting to anything. You didn't need to pay much attention. There was little islands out there. There was a graduate student at Harvard, Noriko Kamachi, who wrote about a guy named Huan Yinxian, who was in the first mission from China to Japan in 1877. And he wrote a wonderful book, probably the best book at the time in China about Japan, but it couldn't get it published. It wasn't published until after 1895. Nobody was interested. I mean, here the guy had done some research, and I'm not an authority, but my impression is that one of the big reasons that Japan won that war is because of information. The Japanese soldier who crossed the border from Korea into Japan in that war, many of them had maps in their pockets of the terrain in China. They had been for a long time doing studies of local Chinese community, local Chinese terrain. They were really very well informed on Chinese geography, Chinese economy, and the Chinese knew nothing about Japan. And some of the historians of that war have said that the Japanese soldiers in Manchuria had a better understanding of the terrain than the Chinese soldiers in that same locality. It's because they had, and they had been collecting information. Now the Chinese interpretation of that collection of information is the Japanese are a warlike period, and they were planning this war for a long time. Some Chinese who are the most patriotic, and who have the most patriotic interpretation, they go way back to Hideyoshi invading Korea and planning to take over all of China, and that there was a continuous plot to take over China, and that's what was it. But a lot of the information had been collected in the period after when China began opening up, late 19th century, was about business people who wanted to prepare, and Japanese wanted to do a lot of business. And I think it's very hard to find that plot line. I mean, it's a natural effort, I think, of a lot of Chinese historians who try to put things together to say that was a continuous plot, and the Japanese DNA was trying to invade and take over places. But the records I've seen, I can't find that line. What I find is a lot of complicated things going on within Japan. Some people wanted to do that, but that wasn't planned. And even the breakout of the war, 1894-95, the Chinese leader in Tokyo at that time reported that the Japanese were so busy with their own internal problems that we don't have to worry anything about Japan. This is just within a year before the war broke out in 1894. So it wasn't obvious that the Japanese had that well-organized plot and plan. But anyhow, that's what happened in 1890. So after 1895, suddenly the Chinese were shocked. They needed to know about the world, and the best place to learn about it was in Japan. Not only was it cheaper than Europe, they could learn all about Europe, often through Japanese translations. Japanese had translated a lot of the most important works that were needed for modernization from European languages into Japanese, and the Chinese could pretty much read a lot of that Japanese of the time. And so they could read the book, so it was a relatively easy where did the Chinese learn about communism? From Kawakami Hajime, you know, a Japanese guy who translated Marxism stuff, and all those words, socialism and so forth, communism, those words, Chinese words, were taken from Japanese. They learned about all the basics of the outside world from 1895. Somehow, I think in the American university curriculum, we haven't talked a lot about that period from 1895 up to World War II as the impact of Chinese students learning from Japan. It was an extraordinary period. There was no place in the world where students from one country were in larger numbers studying in another country than Chinese students in Japan. In 1905, just after the Russo-Japanese War, there were over 10,000 Chinese students studying in Japan. There was no country in the world where any comparable numbers of foreign students. And they studied all kinds of subjects. You take, well, one of the persons, in the back of the book, I've taken a special interest in individuals, and one of the individuals I describe in the back of the book is a guy named Zhang Baili. Zhang Baili, not only Chiang Kai-shek went to a military academy in Japan, but Zhang Baili went to a military academy. When he graduated from that military academy, they ranked students. The top student in the class was Zhang Baili, a foreign student. A Chinese student beat out all the Japanese students. And he became very friendly with a lot of Japanese military people and knew all kinds of things about Japan. And he kept in close touch. This is maybe a little diversion from the main theme, but I think it's an important one. And that is, you know, Mao became famous because one of the things he wrote was on protracted war. But Zhang Baili was an advisor already in the late 20s. He could see that Japan, he knew the Japanese leading generals from military academies. He'd kept up those contacts. And he knew that they were going to invade China, that was coming sooner or later. And he knew that the Chinese were not going to be strong enough and united enough to block it. And he felt that the only way China would win by wearing the Japanese down. And by if the Japanese invaded and stayed long enough, the Chinese could outweigh them and the Japanese get worn out, and that's where the Chinese would win the war. This was already the late 1920s. He was an advisor to Chiang Kai-shek, and of course that's exactly what happened. So Zhang Baili, I think, is a very interesting, important figure who deserves more attention. But among the Chinese who studied in Japan, you name the field. Zhou Enlai was in Japan. So it's not just the Kuomintang. The Kuomintang military leaders in the 30s were mostly, very top leaders were mostly graduates of Japanese military academies. If you take modern Chinese literature, Lu Xun, Zhou Zuoren, You Dafu, Guo Moro, all of them were longtime residents of Japan. Guo Moro lived there for about 20 years. And all these people had spent a lot of time learning, and so that when they came back to China, sort of the modern Chinese literary movement really grew out of these guys who had studied in Japan. And so if you took it, you know, and I haven't investigated scientific fields, but my friends who have say that scientific technology, it was also the same way. That in every major field in China at that time, those people who had studied in Japan made an enormous difference. It was a kind of a complicated period in terms because, you know, now foreign students, we have foreign student advisors and the whole structure. And this happened so quickly, there was never a big structure to advise Chinese students who were coming and to plan and organize it. It was very unstructured, but in Kanda, not too far from Tokyo Station in Japan, there were an awful lot of these Chinese people in guest houses where they lived, and Chinese students, as I say, sometimes 10,000 or more, who lived there in all kinds of fields, picking up modern understanding of Japan. One of the collaborators I've worked with. There are two chapters in this book I did with others. The chapter in that period from 1895 to 1937 is Paula Harrell, who's among the people I know has done the best work on the Chinese students in Japan and the Japanese who went there. There were a few people who in Japan tried to make a special effort to help the Chinese. One was a guy named Kano Jigoro. Kano Jigoro was the guy who introduced judo into the world sports arena and became famous for that. But he led a teacher training school, and a lot of the Chinese who came, some of the Chinese who came to Tokyo went to his teacher training school, where they sort of made the transition before they went to Japanese universities. So there were a few institutions that grew up that were not quite like more modern foreign student advising, but at least helped play that intermediate role. A lot of times the Chinese did not necessarily form good, close friendships with Japan. Sometimes there were special relationships. As you know, Lu Xun in his work talks about Fujino, his anatomy teacher at what is now part of Tohoku University, who corrected and was so helpful. And a lot of the Japanese were not terribly helpful, but somehow, in total, it was a tremendous learning experience for China. And so many of the things that came later were learned in that period. Okay, now let me, I don't mean to, let me say a few words about World War II. I mean, the Japanese did a lot of terrible things during World War II, where a lot of people killed. And my quick summary of the war is that Japanese invaded in large numbers with more modern technology. Chiang Kai-shek quickly changed the battlefield from the North China down into Shanghai, and then from Shanghai through Nanjing. And the Japanese thought if they really gave a wallop to Nanjing, that might be the end of the war. And they committed terrible atrocities in Nanjing. And then after the Battle of Suzhou and Wuhan, there was stalemate, and the Japanese really couldn't go further. They didn't have the power, but there were a couple other outside things. One was that the United States entered the war, and Japan had to send troops to respond to the United States. They also, Nomonhan incident with Russia, where they lost people, and they had to put people on the Russian front. So between putting people on the Russian front, between trying to withstand the United States and the Western Pacific, between some of the things going on in Southeast Asia, Japanese were spread very thin, and they couldn't penetrate really. They didn't have enough force to go beyond, much beyond Wuhan and across the mountains into Chongqing, where Chiang Kai-shek was. Okay, now let me leap up to this third period of learning, which is after 1978. As you know, after Nixon went to China in 1972, Kissinger in 1971, Kissinger in 72, the Japanese didn't want America to get ahead in the Chinese markets. They'd been trying very hard to get back into the Japanese market, and they had trouble. So they quickly normalized relations in 72, even faster than we did, and sent Tanaka Kakue to Tokyo. But things didn't go very far until 1978, the Treaty of Peace and Friendship, which was settled in 1978 and was settled basically by Deng Xiaoping, who was just then returning to power in China. And so in 1978, in the fall, I think Deng Xiaoping realized that soon he would be the top leader, and he wanted to get preparation for that December 1978. So he took one trip to Southeast Asia, and he took one trip to Japan. So in October 1978, Deng Xiaoping goes to Japan, thinking about what he's going to do after he takes over in December, the third plenum of December 1978. And while he was in Tokyo, he went down to Kyoto, and of course he rode on the Shinkansen. He went to see Takasaki Tatsunosuke, there was the Liao-Takasaki agreement, and Takasaki had played such a constructive role. Deng wanted to show sort of his respect for people who played a role, so he visited Takasaki's daughter. But he wanted to ride on the Shinkansen. In those days, China had no high-speed rail. Now they have about as much high-speed rail as the whole world combined. But Deng Xiaoping rode on the high-speed rail, and he wanted China to learn the high-speed rail and have Japan start going deep. The New Japan Steel was, of course, had the most modern factories of steel in the world at that time. Even they had surpassed the United States as modern steel production. So from Tokyo, he went across the Tokyo Bay to see Kimitsu, which was the factory that was as modern as any steel factory in the world, and became the model for Baoshan. And it was the plan so that much of the technology for Baoshan steel came from Kimitsu. And so they introduced all that steel making. He also wanted to begin to get in automobiles. So in those days, Nissan, as you know, is now in trouble for all kinds of reasons. But at that time, Nissan had the most up-to-date robots on the assembly line. And so he visited their plant in just south of Tokyo, and saw the most modern automobiles. He asked people, he says, how many per capita worker, per worker, how many cars do you produce a year? The answer was something like that, 97, 98. He says, we do about one a year. I mean, their automobile industry was way backward. It was almost like handicraft automobile building. So the modern thing came from Japan. And then he went down to Osaka, and he visited a guy he called the god of modern enterprise, Matsushita Konosuke. Matsushita Konosuke had been in China in the 1920s and 30s, and he had the vision of selling modern electronics to China. He didn't want to give the most modern. They had a little discussion. Deng said, we want the most modern, television factories. So Matsushita had to explain that firms make their money from having the high end of technology. And we want to help you have TV technology, but we still want to stay in business. And some of the most modern, we may not be able to sell you the most up to date, but we'll help you. And he built a lot of TV factories and electronic. It was, of course, the day before computers and so forth, but it was the day of introducing television and computers and simple electronic technology. So in the 1980s, Japan gave more money for building China and passed on more technology. From the Japanese point of view, they felt that the way to get rid of what they'd done, the horrible things in World War II, was to try to be helpful in modernization. And so I think that the Chinese criticisms of Japan for being short on apologies is very justified. Japan did not apologize much. They were pretty much closed to China during the critical period after World War II. So they didn't really, from 45 to 72, had almost no contact. So the Japanese leaders who came to power in the 1970s, they say, why should I apologize? I wasn't even in power. I didn't do anything. That was a different generation. We're different. So they were not ready to apologize. And somehow they have not been as deeply apologetic as the Germans were in Europe. And so I think there is justified, it's quite understandable why Chinese feel so upset that the Japanese did not face history. But from the Japanese who wanted to be helpful, their idea was that we won't apologize, but we'll try to help China with their technology. And it was not just technology. I think that the Japanese contributions to China in the 1980s, of course it's quite well known in Japan, but not outside of Japan. One group, for example, that I think deserves much more attention, I don't know whether there are good studies of this by now or not, is the Okita Saburo group was of high-level advisors He was the head of the Economic Planning Agency in Japan, 1955, when they began to move ahead. He had been very active after World War II in Japanese planning. He had been trained as a telephone engineer, but he got involved in post-war planning in Japan in 1945. He was born in Manchuria. He grew up and went to school in Manchuria. And he had his kind of special interest in China and played a very key role. Gumu invited a group of Japanese advisors to come, and it was headed by Okita Saburo, and they had people like Shimoko Obe, Hatsushi, and so forth in that group who went as advisors to China. And I think the reason that was so important is Japan had a late developer instinct, and the government had played a role in trying to move the economy forward. Chalmers Johnson made the distinction between America as a regulatory state and Japan as a country that was trying to modernize. So the government played a role not in setting the rules for fair play, but in trying to advance a catch-up country. So to lead a catch-up country, that's what Japan did. They had advisors who, in a market economy, trying to move the country forward. So here's Deng Xiaoping. He wants to move the country forward in a modern economy. He wants the government to play a role. And so in a way, Japan was a more appropriate advisor in that kind of role of what government can do to promote and modernize the sector, and what kind of, how you deal with the private market economy, how you deal with private economy. And so Okita Saburo and Shimoko Obe and that group of people were much more appropriate to the high-level planners for the overall effort of what China was doing. So I think it was not just in the factory plan. I remember in the 80s when I was traveling around Guangdong factories, I would see signs, we have Japanese management. There were a lot of signs on the walls about Japanese management and technology and so forth. But there was, in addition to that, there was also this high-level group fundamentally trying to modernize the country. So that was played an enormous role. So I get my conclusion from all this is that the two countries are in very deep into each other. They've had very close relationships with each other. They played a very prominent, the leaders have played a prominent role. There's a very deep understanding, and they've had a lot of terrible problems. And I think the peak of the really bad problems was 2008 to 2014. Now, in learning, of course, in all these cases I mentioned, it's the country that's behind that's learning from the country that's ahead. So from 600 to 1895, China was in the top position, and Japan was in the lower position. From 1895 to this period of about 2008 to 2012, Japan was in the top position. And 2008 to 2012, 2010 was the year that the World Bank said the Chinese economy has passed the Japanese in size. But in 2008, they had the Asia financial crisis, and you also had the wonderful Beijing Olympics. So I think China was already feeling they had arrived. And so in 2010, there was a big change. So, you know, a lot of people look at this 2010, 2012 from the period of bad management and politics. but I think there was a fundamental thing going on at that time. That is that China was passing Japan. And by 2014, when they began to meet, you had this new situation where China's again on top. From the period of 1895 to 2012, they weren't. And now I think we're in a new era when China is on the top and Japan is under. And I think what's happened is that they're beginning to develop a new relationship with this understanding. There's a lot of transitional difficulties when one nation passes another. But I think that in 2014, they began to adjust to that era. And Chinese have already begun to change their attitude toward Japan a little. I think the fact that the 8 million tourists go to Japan, this country is not so bad. We see characters on the signs, we're familiar with that. And these people are polite to us, and it's nice, it's clean, it's orderly. It's not so bad after all. I think the impact of tourism is one thing. I think it's also that in the way they've grown from a country that's passing to feeling, okay, we've now passed. And I think Japan has gained new respect for Chinese. I think it wasn't just technology. In 1885, a leading Japanese thinker, Fukuzawa Yukichi, said we ought to leave Asia. Well, he meant that it wasn't much to learn from China anymore. We ought to be learning from the West. And I think from that fundamental period from about that time until around 2010, Japanese leaders felt China was way behind. But by 2010-12, they could see that China was way up in technology. They had learned a lot, they'd studied a lot since opening, and they were rising to a very important position. So I think there's now a new recognition that in Japan, not only is China passing us economically, but they're up there in terms of modern science and technology and administration. They're thinking about a lot of issues in a very first-class way. They still have a lot to learn from us, but we have much more respect from China. So I think there is hope that the two countries now can begin to have better relations. So in my book, when I was originally planning, I was going to preach to China and Japan, you guys ought to start getting to know each other and having better relations. When my book came out, finally, they were already starting to do that.